Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for something a little bit different. I'm recording this before the Ban and Restricted update goes live on the Monday, but I am putting this video out after that. So I thought instead of making a video that's going to be out of date before it even goes out, I thought I would make a video about something that some of you have been asking for in the comments, and that is an introduction to the other format I play, which is Premodern. So, Premodern is a format that is closed. This means there's not going to get any new cards printed for it, which makes it quite appealing to people who don't like having their cards obsoleted. It also plays with a lot of cards from what I like to think of as sort of the golden era of Magic the Gathering. So, the sets that are legal in this format, 4th edition through to Scourge. So what this means is that all the really old broken stuff, you know, like your Moxes and your Black Lotuses and stuff like that, and Soul Rings, they're not in the format. And then on the other side of the coin, the sets that are legal in this format stop before creatures really got super powerful and too scary. So it's a much slower pace of play here. Lots of sort of eking out minor advantages, but there is some really powerful stuff you can do, and you can even win on turn 1 with some decks, but it's not like the part and parcel of the format. It's just a thing that can sometimes happen when the stars align. But mostly you're going to be playing quite a few turns of Magic. So let's also look at the ban list, because that is a good way to see how the format is curated. So first up, as always, all the sort of anti-cards, where you have to like put cards from your deck into the anti-pile, those are just not legal in its format, so don't have to worry about those. But in terms of like actual real cards that you're going to be familiar with, what isn't in the format? So we don't have Balance, which is obviously quite a powerful card, a very unsymmetrical symmetrical effect. There's no Brainstorm, so the quality of cantrips we have is quite different. We have no Channel, because this is just a very easy way of powering out some really busted stuff early on. Demonic Consultation is deemed as too powerful a tutor, as is Entomb. There's also no Earthcraft, no Flash. Force of Will not being in the format is a really big one. So the quality of free permission you get in this format is incredibly different to Legacy, but we will go over that later on. No Goblin Recruiter, so you can't just stack your deck and just have all the juice you want on top with all the goblins. Grim Monolith is deemed too powerful of mana ramp. There are things like Voltaic Key in the format. Land Tax is deemed too powerful a card advantage engine here. Mana Vault is too much of mana ramp. Memory Jar. So basically what you're seeing here is a lot of cards that are banned in other formats or have been banned in other formats over the years. You know, like Mind Twist is banned in Legacy as well. Mind's Desire was banned in Legacy until quite recently as well. Tendrils of Agony is an interesting one that is banned here, because Tendrils of Agony is kind of the go-to win condition in Legacy Storm, but it's just not a thing that you get to do in Premodern, because I think it would be a little bit too easy to string that together, given the pace of play of the format is a little bit slower, and there's not as good permission to stop it. Strip Mine is not allowed here. Mystical Tutor, Necro, not exactly surprises of things that you would see banned from the format. Time Spiral, another reload that is going to be very easy to leverage in a format like this with lower permission. Tolarian Academy, not much needs to be said about this one. It's been banned in many formats. It's pretty busted. Again, 1-mana tutors deemed too strong. Windfall, not legal for the same reasons as things like Memory Jar. World Gorger Dragon, this is something that is legal in Legacy, but wasn't for a while, if I remember rightly. So this is just a thing that allows you to assemble a combo with like Animate Dead or whatever, where you can just pop off infinitely with it. Like, as long as you're phasing out your permanent, like, you're not phasing your permanents out, you're blinking your permanents out in and out, and then you're going to be able to drain your opponent down or whatever. So this is a combo that we sometimes see played in reanimated decks in Legacy. And then Yawgmoth's Will and Yawgmoth's Bargain. So not exactly a surprising section of cards that are banned. I think the big ones that are not necessarily surprising, but make it quite different from like Legacy formats in terms of what we're allowed to play with, is the Tendrils not being legal and Force of Will not being legal. Those are two really big differences here, and obviously Brainstorm. So what does this format actually look like? We've seen what's not in the format, and we know what sets are legal, but what does that actually translate to in terms of what people are playing? So I've assembled a bunch of cards I think are really important to know about in this format that are kind of like pillars of the format in certain way, shapes, or forms. So I've broken them down to colours, so we're just going to go through them now so you get a little bit of an idea. Swords to Plowshares is the pinnacle of removal spells in Legacy, and it's a pinnacle of removal spells in Premodern as well. This is a big part of the power that White has in the format. Disenchant. Now, in the format of Premodern, playing things like Disenchant in your main deck is a thing that people do. It is not uncommon to see 2, sometimes even 3 Disenchant style effects, which is really interesting because there's no Planeswalkers in this format. It's creatures, artifacts, enchantments, lands, as are only permanent types really. So Disenchant actually clips quite a lot, and back in the day, creatures weren't so good, but some of the non-creature permanents were pretty strong. So Disenchant is actually quite a relevant answer because you're going to be expecting these things out of a lot of people's decks. Armageddon I put on this list because Armageddon is something that people are playing. There's like a few Terravore decks out there that are playing Armageddon and stuff, or you can just set up a board state and just smash everyone's lands, and that is really hard for some decks to come back from. So it is a lot like gaming how it used to be. Replenish. So this is a card that returns all enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. Why is this good? Well, one of the best decks in the format is the Replenish deck, and we'll explain exactly why that is by looking at some other cards. First up, we have Opalescence. So each other non-aura enchantment is a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and toughness equal to its mana value. So we've seen this in Legacy in the Leylines meme deck, but in Premodern, this is actually the Wink edition of one of the very best decks in Replenish. So what we're doing here is we're assembling enchantments, So Parallax Wave is one of the big ones here. So it's got Fading. So Fading is you remove a counter at the beginning of your upkeep. If you can't remove a counter, you sacrifice it. So it's different to Vanishing. And you can just remove one of those counters at any time to exile a creature. And then when Parallax Wave leaves the battlefield, you can put all those cards back. However, there is ways of breaking this. So if you play Parallax Wave and your opponent has 5 creatures, you target a creature, and then holding priority, you target another creature. Holding priority, you do this until you've targeted all the creatures. Then you blow up or bounce your Parallax Wave. So you can blow it up with something like a Disenchant or a Seal of Cleansing, or bounce it with a Chain of Vapor. And then what happens is the leave the battlefield trigger of returning the cards happens, and then all the resolution of the exiling the creatures happens. So you permanently exile all their creatures. This is quite a powerful thing to do. There is a card called Parallax Tide in blue, which does exactly the same thing, but with lands. Now, this is definitely the best thing you can be doing in Premodern, in my opinion. It is really strong, and it is winning a lot of stuff, because one-sided Armageddons are pretty darn good. So, you've got these Parallax Tides, these Parallax Waves, and what happens is you play these out, and you can control your opponent's board, and then you can bring them all back with Replenish, and then your opponent has a horrible time. If you assemble Opalescence and Parallax Wave, what happens is the Parallax Wave can target itself to reset the number of counters on it, and it can use its own ability to trigger its leaves the battlefield trigger. So you can just permanently exile all creatures forever once you have this, and also if you get the Parallax Tide for all lands, and you can just do that all at instant speed. There are cards like Attunement, which is an enchantment that lets you discard a bunch of cards and draw some cards, and cycle things into your graveyard so you can get a big replenish off early. But that's something you have to be aware of in this format. That's kind of like one of the more powerful top ends that's going on in the format. But back to sort of more regularly looking staples. We were talking about cantrips. Portent is about the sort of best kind of cantrip we have. It's a ponder, but slower. We've seen this play in Legacy and Miracles decks and stuff. It's fine if you don't need to dig for a card immediately. If you are a deck that's digging for cards immediately, you have things like Sleight of Hand, which is just look at the top 2, put one in your hand, one on the bottom of your library. So that's the sort of level of cantrips we're working with. So it's not as sort of Xeroxy as Legacy can be, where you can just spew off a bunch of ponders and brainstorm that hit each other and keep sort of snowballing. So this kind of encourages people to play a slightly slower game, because you need to leverage the card on the following turn. So it's not about getting the right tools immediately, it's about setting up future turns. Days, obviously an absolute all-star banger in Legacy. You can play it in Premodern. Now, part of the problem with Days in Premodern is the fact that you don't have any dual lands, which is really key. So if you want to play Days reliably, you kind of need to have quite a lot of basic islands in your deck. Also, because the games are slower, it's a lot easier to play around a Days in a format like this, because you're not under the same pressure you are in Legacy of like 1 mana 3 drops bopping you hard. In terms of other counterspells, we have actual factual counterspell sees quite a lot of play in Premodern. So an oldie but a goodie. You also see Mana Leak, which is 1 and a blue, counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. That's the sort of level of counterspell you're dealing with for the most part. You also have some free permission in the form of foil. So this is basically the force of will of the format, except it's quite a lot more costly to use. So you may discard an island card and another card to pay the spell's mana cost. Now, the fact that you're discarding them means that sometimes actually putting the cards in your graveyard can be useful for later on. But this is obviously 2 cards to Force of Will instead of 1 card. So it is quite a bit different, and it requires islands again, so it's got some deck building restrictions to it there. The last of the blue cards I want to talk about here is Gush. This is one of the sort of primary draw spells in the format. You just return 2 islands you control, and then you draw 2 cards. So this is effectively 0 mana, draw 2. Now it does come with a drawback of bouncing islands, but the format is relatively slow compared to something like Legacy, so you have the time to redeploy them. You don't need to just use them all now, but you get to float mana from them in the first place, so really it doesn't actually make a huge amount of difference to you. And this card is banned in Legacy because it's very, very strong. Whereas here we get to play it, which is really cool. One of the reasons why Premodern is sweet is because there are a bunch of cards that are banned in Legacy that you get to play here. Because they don't necessarily have the other stuff that goes with them that makes them really, really overpowered in some of the other formats. So you can sort of have these as power outliers that are actually kind of okay because of what goes with them. But yeah, Gush is a thing you have to be aware of that exists in the format. Other card advantage spells are things like Accumulated Knowledge and Fact or Fiction. Alright, now on to the black stuff. So this is kind of what creatures look like in Premodern. So black for a 2/2 that hurts you on your upkeep. So there are like mono black aggressive decks that play a bunch of like Carnophage, Sarcomancy, stuff like that, turn creatures sideways and then disrupt your hand to sort of get over the finish line. That is a viable strategy in Premodern. And that's kind of interesting. Normally we'd expect to see creatures a lot bigger than this on the channel. But when you're working at a lower power level, this is sort of what we end up with. However, the existence of Dark Ritual means that you can sometimes find 3 of these 2/2s on turn 1, and that can be a lot for decks to overcome. Dark Ritual is obviously one of the most powerful black cards that is in this format, and arguably one of the most powerful black cards ever printed. So it allows us to power out some stuff, including Hypnotic Spectre, like the good old days. So this is a card that is basically in not every black deck, but in a lot of black decks. And it allows for decks with maybe not necessarily the highest power level to be able to compete with more powerful stuff because they just get to jump the curve and say, okay, well actually, can you deal with like 6 power on turn 1? And then I'm going to be like disrupting your hand and stuff later on. And speaking of hand disruption, we have Duress. There is no Thoughtseize in this format. You have Duress, and then you have Cabal Therapy. Those are your main ways of attacking your opponent's hand. And obviously, Cabal Therapy, you need to know what your opponent's playing, and you don't always hit with it. But Cabal Therapy is a thing we know from Legacy that's very strong. But Duress sees a lot of Legacy play too, and it is a fine card to be using in just about every single black deck. What I will say is that because the power level of creatures is relatively low in this format, it means that people have a lot more juicy spells, or non-creature, non-land cards, I should say, that you can hit with your Duresses. Phyrexian Arena. Because the games tend to be a little bit slower, you can leverage a card like Phyrexian Arena. People are Dark Ritualing this out on turn 1, and it just gives them incremental advantage over the course of several turns. Again, this is another reason why people are running Disenchant, because stuff like this is a viable way that people are constructing their decks, so having answers to it isn't the worst. But yeah, we're trying to have games that go a little bit longer in this format, so Phyrexian Arena does a good job of pulling you ahead, and this is sort of some classic black card advantage. There's a few other options for black card advantage, things like Graveborn Muse and Skeletal Scrying. Next up we have Sutured Ghoul. This is pretty much like the oops, I win sort of card in the format. Now, what does it do? Well, it's very expensive and we're never casting it. It's a Trampler, and when it enters, exile any number of creature cards from your graveyard, and its power and toughness are equal to the power and toughness of all the creatures added up. So, the way people are winning with this is by milling their deck, and then this comes into play, and usually has haste. There is an enchantment that jumps out the graveyard if a creature with converted mana cost 6 or greater enters the battlefield. It just jumps out and attaches right to it, and it gives it haste. So people are milling their decks in various different ways, or they're casting things like Buried Alive to put like 2 massive creatures and a Sutured Ghoul into your graveyard, and then you can reanimate the Sutured Ghoul with something like a Shallow Grave, so it has haste anyway. So there's a few decks that use Sutured Ghoul. The Shallow Grave build can kill on turn 1 thanks to things like Dark Ritual, but generally it takes a couple of turns to get going. But yeah, this is kind of like your big splashy I win combo card that you see not that often, but it is something you need to be aware of. Next up, we're into red. Goblin Lackey is legal. Now, there's no Muxus to jam in like there is in Legacy, but you can still put in a Siege Gang Commander, which, in the context of Premodern, is pretty backbreaking for a lot of opponents. That's a lot of power and a lot of ability to ping stuff off. So, a lot of decks need to have answers to turn 1 Goblin Lackey. You will see Chain of Vapor in a lot of decks. It answers various problems, but it is just a way of stopping the Goblin Lackey on turn 1 from just running the entire game. So, if you're building a deck in this format, you need to be aware of what you do if your opponent plays a turn 1 Goblin Lackey. So, this is definitely something you need to be very aware of. Goblins is one of the very best decks in the format, and is very popular and very fun to play, with actually quite a lot of choices about how you can play out your hand quite often. Jackal Pup. This is what a red creature looks like in this format. It's a 2/1 for 1 with a drawback. When it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to you. So if your opponent blocks it with like a 12/12 creature, you're taking 12. But this is just recurring damage that you can apply, and one of the most popular decks in the format that is actually pretty good is the mono red slide deck. So it runs things like Jackal Pup and Mog Fanatic and a bunch of things like that. And they just have some burn spells to finish your opponent off and get over the finish line. Speaking of burn spells, Lightning Bolt is illegal in this format. This is sort of the god tier of burn spells, and we get to run it here. I don't think I really have to talk very much about why Lightning Bolt is great. On to green. We have Argothian Enchantress. This is a card that you're probably familiar with from Legacy. There are Enchantress decks in Legacy. They're a little bit fringe, but in Premodern, they're really good because the format's slower. There's not as many like combos sort of smashing you out, so you can leverage the card advantage of this card over numerous turns and set up blocks using things like Solitary Confinement. I think Enchantress recently won one of the really big events. I think it was LobsterCon. So this is a strategy that is very effective here in this format. Oath of Druids. This is a card that is really busted and banned in Legacy, but in Premodern we get to play it for some reason. So what this means is if any player starts their upkeep and they have fewer creatures than their opponent, they will mill cards from the top of the library until they hit a creature, and then that creature will go into play. So there are people who are just using this as a way to mess up aggro decks, because aggro decks really struggle if they're trying to play like Jackal Pups, and then you play this and can just get like a 7-drop out on turn 3. That is really hard going. But there are also decks like Terravor that play this, and then it mills a bunch of cards into your graveyard, and those cards are going to be lands. So when it finds your Terravor, you end up with like just a massive like 12 to 20 power creature for like your 2-mana off the Oath of Druids, which also changes the way that a lot of games are played out. This card is in quite a lot of decks. You'll see it in many, many sideboards because, okay, how am I going to beat this creature deck? Just shove in some Oaths and Phantom Nishoba. Phantom Nishoba is like a 7-mana, 7/7 trample lifelink creature, basically. So yeah, Oath of Druids is something you really have to be aware of and find ways to get through it. This is another reason why you see things like Disenchant and also Naturalize, which is just Disenchant but in green. You see them in main decks all the time. Another broken card that isn't legal in Legacy. This is Survivor of the Fittest. This allows you to find any creature card in your deck by just discarding a creature card and paying green. And you can do this as many times as you like in your turn. There are numerous decks that are built around this, including Elves and Survival Rock. So whether or not you just want to play like something really combo-y like Elves, where you can find all your combo pieces and just keep going, or you want to play something like the Survival Rock deck where you're using this to find all the right answers in your silver bullets, Survivor of the Fittest is an incredibly powerful card and really does change the way that a lot of games play out. Like if you're playing against any of the decks that run Survival and they don't have Survival, it feels alright. When they have Survival, it just feels like utterly hopeless sometimes because they're always going to have the right things they want. And they obviously pair it with things like Squee, which comes back to their hand every single turn, so they can always just get cards. So not only are they getting +1 card a turn, that one card is going to be the specific creature they want every turn. A really powerful effect that you have to be aware of, and one of the main reasons that people play green in the format. Call of the Herd. This is just another example of what creatures look like in this format. This is one of the better sort of mid-rangey threats that you can play in Premodern. So 3 mana for a 3/3 elephant, and then you can pay 4 mana on the following turn, or any turn while this is in your graveyard, and then you get another 3/3. So 2 3/3s for one card is a pretty good rate. A 3 mana 3/3, pretty good rate. Elephants are the order of the day in Premodern. Thermocast. The reason I put this on there is land destruction is a real thing in Premodern. It is a viable strategy. I was talking about the Terravor earlier. There is a Terravor deck that runs a whole bunch of Thermocast and Stone Rain style effects to just blow up your opponent's lands whilst making their Terravor bigger. And that is a key piece of disruption that you have to be aware of in this format. There is like, I think there's 3 3-mana green land destruction spells. There's 3 black 3-mana land destruction spells. There's 2 or 3 red ones. There's a whole bunch of land destruction that people run, so you have to be aware of it. It is a key part of how the format works, which is kind of nice because it means people are trying to play more expensive spells than 3 mana, so a 3-mana land destruction spell is actually quite relevant. Ravenous Baloth. This is what sort of the peak of creatures that you're actually casting fairly look like in Premodern. Just a 4-mana 4/4 where you can sacrifice any beast, including itself, to gain 4 life. So it's just a 4-mana 4/4 with a bit of upside. And this is very much like one of the bigger mid-rangey creatures that you'll see in the format. So it's just good to know about that. Meddling Mage. This is a very main deckable card in the format. So much like with Cabal Therapy existing, you need to have a little bit of information about what the format is like and what the decks are, but it rewards you for that format knowledge. Meddling Mage just gets to shut down certain problem pieces that you might be scared of. There are a bunch of decks that run it, some decks in the sideboard, some decks in the main. You're looking at things like even replenished decks running this in the sideboard. Then there's cards like decks like Dump Truck, which is basically just like Esper Good Stuff that runs it. And there's various blue-white control decks, and there's a blue-white-red deck called The Solution that runs things like Meddling Mage and Lightning Angel and a bunch of stuff like that. Next we're on to lands, which is a really important thing to know about this format. So we have Ancient Tomb, which means you can ramp stuff out. Now there's not anything super duper scary to go for like 2 and a red like there is in Legacy, where there's entire decks built around the fact that Ancient Tomb exists. Also, Ancient Tomb is not the only card like this. We also have City of Traitors, which is another land that taps for 2 as well, that you should know from Legacy. So what are people using Ancient Tombs for the most part? Ramping out stuff for the Replenish deck is one of them, but the other one is prison-y style decks. So playing things like Sphere of Resistance on turn 1 and stuff like that. So there are some decks using Ancient Tomb, but it's not like everywhere, because mana bases in this format are a little bit sketchy. So Caves of Koilos. This is about as good as mana fixing gets in the format. So this is what our dual lands are like in the format. So we can't fetch them, and they hurt us when we get the colours we want. So quite a lower power level than what you're used to seeing on this channel when I play Legacy. This is about the power level we're looking at in terms of the format. And because of things like this, it means that decks like Jackal-Pup decks have a lot more reach, because people are actually giving up quite a lot of life to pay a bunch of spells and stuff. Which takes us on to City of Brass, which is the best mana fixing in the format. It gives you any colour you want at the low price of losing 1 life whenever you do it, or having 1 damage dealt to you. And this underpins a lot of decks. Even 2-colour decks have to lean into City of Brass, because if you're playing a 2-colour deck that is not allied colours, then you don't necessarily have the land support to make that work without things like City of Brass. Gaia's Cradle is a pretty busted land that we know and love from Legacy, and it's here. This is a main component of the Elf deck, which exists in the format. It's a bit different to Elves in Legacy, but it still does a lot of powerful stuff, and this gives you plenty of green mana to put into your Survivor of the Fittest and get whatever you need. Mistress Factory. This is basically the god standard of man lands in the format. This sees a lot of play in a lot of decks, from colourless decks to sometimes like even 3-colour decks I've seen running Mistress Factory. The reason why this is so good is because on blocks, you can pay 1 to activate it, you can block, tap itself to pump it by +1/+1, and then you have a 3/3 blocker. Now we've already discussed the quality of creatures, things like Carnophage and Jackal-Pup. A 3/3 blocker is a huge deal. And this is part of the answer that some people run to deal with things like Goblin Lackey on turn 1. If you're on the play and play Mistress Factory, turn 2 play a land, all of a sudden you're covered against Goblin Lackey. So this is a really key card. Other man lands that see play, things like Fairy Conclave, Treetop Village. So there are man lands, but this is definitely like the god standard one. Rishadan Port. Mana Denial, I've already mentioned, is a big part of this format, and Rishadan Port is no slouch here. In a lot of ways, this is better here than it is in Legacy, because people aren't playing as many fetch lands, and they're playing a lot more basics. So you can't necessarily interact with basics as well as you can with non-basics. And Rishadan Port just gives you that lever to hit the basics, as well as the fact that we've already discussed that people are trying to play slightly more expensive spells than in a format like Legacy. So Rishadan Ports are really good for clamping down your opponent. We also have Wasteland as well. So you quite often see Wastelands and Rishadan Ports together as like a package to really strip away your opponent's ability to play the game. Trevor's Ruins. This is another example of what lands look like in this format. So when this enters, sacrifice it unless you return a non-rare land you control to its owner's hand. So you can just bounce like one of your Pain lands or a basic land. But this comes in untapped, and it taps for 3 colours. One of these exists for every sort of allied shard colour combination. So you've got your Bant and your Esper and your Jund or whatever. So you will see these relatively often. There are some decks that actually utilise the bouncing in a positive way. So they'll use this to bounce a City of Traitors and continue to deploy lands, and then can redeploy that City of Traitors later because you can stack the triggers in a favourable fashion. Or you can bounce things like a Glacial Chasm. And there are people that play things like Winter Orb and Stasis and stuff like that. So having ways that you can bounce your lands back to your hand is actually really relevant. So this is quite an important piece. You don't see it everywhere and not in every deck and not 4-ofs, but it is an important piece to know it exists. And then we have fetch lands. Now we only have allied colour fetch lands. So we have Wooded Foothills, Flowstrand, Polluted Delta, Bloodstained Mire, that sort of thing. So it's a lot easier building a mana base in allied colours than it is in enemy colours, which is kind of nice that there is actually that difference. It's not just you get to play whatever you want. There are trade-offs for trying to do these things. If you look back in Magic's history, the quality of dual lands, it took a very long time for them to not be really bad. Basically, I think Ravnica was the first time that we had like really good dual lands, to be honest. Like obviously like these are fine and the pay lands are fine, but generally speaking, in the olden days, it wasn't always the easiest to assemble a perfectly working mana base. And because of that, that is why things like Rishadan Port, Wasteland, Thermocast, they become more important because people's mana bases aren't as free and easy to access all their colours as they are in other formats. So it just adds a little bit more of a new dynamic that you can play in that you maybe don't get to play as much in other formats. Speaking of mana, Mox Diamond is legal in this format. It may cost many, many pennies in real life, but this card is an absolute banger in this format. It allows you to accelerate stuff out. Now, we're not accelerating anything as scary as you can do in Legacy. There are a bunch of decks that use this. For example, the Terravor Thermocast deck. It uses these because then it ends up being able to do land destruction earlier or play Oath on turn 1. There are also decks using Weathered Wayfarer, which wants you to have fewer lands than your opponent to activate. So this allows you to do that. So it's definitely a big piece that is worth having in your collection if you're playing Premodern. But thankfully, Premodern is a very proxy-friendly format in most places that play it. So you don't have to fork out like £2,000 or whatever it is for a set of these. Black Vice. This is an actual legitimate win condition in this format. There are a few decks that use it. So prison decks, including things like Stasis, where they just let this drain you out over the course of however many turns. And yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can make your opponent's hand be flush with cards whilst not actually causing you too much hassle. Things like prison-y land style decks with cards like Mana Breach and then a bunch of other prison-y components so people can't deploy the cards in their hand and just get eaten alive by the Black Vice. So yeah, this is a legitimate card that is a win condition, and again, another reason why things like Disenchant are main deckable in the format. Speaking of reasons for Disenchant to be main deckable, we have Phyrexian Dreadnought, a 1-mana 12/12 Trampler. We know and love this card from Legacy, and it's probably the best deck, if not the second best deck in the format of Premodern. So we have Stifle, so we play this, we stifle the trigger, we have a 12/12. We also have Vision Charm, so we play this, we use Vision Charm to give it phasing, it phases out, and then we don't have anything to sack to the trigger, then when it comes back in, it treats itself like it was always there. This is a card that is shaping the format in a lot of ways. People need to know how they're going to deal with a Phyrexian Dreadnought. This is something that, if you have no plan for this, you are going to have a bad time. Now, you know, there's various removal spells that hit it. Things like Artifact Destruction is obviously very good against it, but then you have Swords to Plowshares is a common answer to this. Things like Smother and a few other bits and pieces snuff out as well. So there are plenty of answers to this, but you don't get a lot of time to deal with it because it hits you so hard. Last up, we have Tanglewire. So this is a really key prison card, but we also see it in combo decks because sometimes you just need a few turns to draw your pieces, play out your lands, and get going. So we saw a big breakout of a deck at the LobsterCon. It was the Flinker deck, which is a prison-y style deck that uses Tinker to go and find its win condition, and its win condition is Phyrexian Devourer, where you can exile cards from top of your library, and it pumps your creature, except when it gets to a certain size, it puts on a trigger that's going to die, but you can keep pumping it in response, and then you can use Fling to throw your opponent, or you can pitch it into an Altar of Dimension and mill your opponent out. So that deck uses Tanglewire as a way of slowing the game down, but also giving itself an artifact that it can go and tinker away. And you see this in decks like Elves, where they're playing out lots of permanents, so it's going to be very lopsided in terms of how the Tanglewire interacts. It's just a key prison piece that you need to know and be aware of. So these are just some of the main deck cards I think is really worth talking about, but I've also got some sideboard cards to talk about, because that's a really key part of how these games play out. Okay, so these are a bunch of sideboard cards that see pretty regular play in the format, so you need to know what they're about. Now, we mentioned that the burn decks are pretty good in the format, and that's why you're going to see a lot of these cards. For example, Circle of Protection Red can just shut down a red deck very easily. The mono red decks basically are left with having to try and overload this by attacking them with so many things that they can't fog them all, or to be using their Curse Scroll to finish their opponent off. The fact that Circle of Protection Red is a big player in sideboards lets you know quite a lot about this format, in my opinion. There is also Sacred Ground. We've mentioned how lands get destroyed a lot. Well, this makes it so that your lands being destroyed isn't actually that much of an issue. You'll see this in a lot of white decks, especially decks that have got a high curve. So things like Replenish are quite often going to be playing Sacred Ground because they are susceptible to land destruction because they're trying to cast like 4 drops, like on consecutive turns as well. Then we have Warmth, just another answer for red decks. Whenever opponent casts a red spell, you gain 2 life. You're going to see a trend here. Chill. Red spells cost 2 more to cast. So the mono red burn deck, slide deck, whatever you want to call it, is a really, really good deck. And that is why you see so much hate for it in the sideboard, which means it often doesn't do well, because if people are prepared for it, it just doesn't win. It's a bit like Dredge used to be, where it's a really powerful deck, but if people are prepared for it, it's not going to win. Hibernation is a nice little thing that blue decks have access to, bouncing all green permanents there in its hands. You see this relatively often in sideboards. Then we're on to black. Black's got some pretty good hoses. As you can see, these are all classic hoses from back in the day. Engineered Plague. So we spoke about how goblins and elves are really good decks. Well, Engineered Plague steps up and hits that. We also mentioned that Flinker deck. So you can play this on Phyrexian. So Phyrexian Devourer will die to state-based effects because it's a 1/1 at base. So this is another way that you can interact with that combo as well. I just wouldn't play a black deck without access to Engineered Plague. I think it's really, really useful and a key part of how to interact with decks post-board. Gloom. Sometimes you get sick of white decks and you just put Gloom in your sideboard. And I'm all here for that. This card is really, really horrible to play against. And in the colour of Dark Ritual, you can put out on turn 1. Pretty big deal. We've got Dystopia here. This is a classic hoser. So at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a green or white permanent of their choice. This has cumulative upkeep. But this can just stop your opponent from deploying stuff. You can just pay a few life and they never get on board. Or if they've got a decent selection of stuff on board, you can absolutely crunch through it and give your opponent no real good choices. Really powerful hoser, this one. Overload. This is kind of what Artifact Destruction looks like. You also have things like Meltdown and the cards we mentioned that are in people's main decks. You're seeing a lot more Overload at the moment because it's very good at killing Phyrexian Dreadnought for very cheap. Pyroblast, there's also Hydroblast. Pyroblast is very good in the format because back in the day, blue was easily the best colour, and we sort of see that in the results of pre-modern tournaments as well. A lot of the best decks are blue, so Pyroblast is just an absolute banger there. It's one of the few ways that you can interact with people trying to Parallax Tide combo you. So instead of worrying about losing all your lands, you can just blow it up on the stack, and then your opponent never gets that window. Because once it's in play, it's very hard to answer the Tide, because they're probably going to hold priority, remove all your stuff, and then interact with it themselves. But the Pyroblast being able to hit on the stack is a big deal. Pyroclasm, we mentioned various aggro decks. This is just a really nice tool to have access to as well. Anarchy, again, all the bangers of hoses here. Destroying all white permanents, very nice. Xantid Swarm, there's a lot of counterspell decks. There are decks that rely almost exclusively on counterspells as their game plan of defense, and Xantid Swarm can just poke through that really nicely. Whether you're doing mid-rangey stuff or combo stuff, this can be really important, and I've won quite a few games off the back of this card. Compost, there's black decks that want to disrupt your hand in a big way. So there's a deck called Pit Rack that uses Bottomless Pit, which makes every player discard a card at random at the beginning of their turn, and it uses the rack. So Compost is just a good way of insulating yourself against that sort of strategy. The hand disruption is a key part of the format, and this is a good way of trying to blank that. Gaia's Blessing. You sometimes see this in the sideboard, but actually you probably see more copies of it in people's main decks, because some of these games go a very long time, and Gaia's Blessing can just give you that like eternal churn of cards where you're never going to run out of cards, and it also helps prevent you getting killed by things like the Ultra Dementia kills, and there's also Brain Freeze is one of the key Stormwind conditions. So sometimes you'll see this in the sideboard just to prevent yourself getting milled, but you'll quite often see two in the main deck of decks that are milling themselves with things like Oath of Druids. Graveyard Hate is a key part. We already mentioned Suture Ghoul existing, but there's things like Psychotog, and then other things that leverage cards in their graveyard, whether it's like Genesis, Recurring Nightmare, stuff like that. So having Graveyard Hate is really, really clutch. So Tormod's Crypt is something that everyone can use and is a key part in keeping the format stable and healthy. Phyrexian Furnace, you see this in people's main decks because it can cycle draw a card, a bit like how you see Soul Guide Lantern in Legacy decks. But this just only exiles the bottom card, or you pay one to exile a specific card. So you can keep a graveyard under wraps for decks that are trying to leverage a critical amount of cards in the graveyard. So Threshold is a popular deck in the format, so being able to hit that is really important. Then we have some other hoses that I like to play in Legacy, things like Curse Totem and Null Rod. If you want to stop activated abilities of certain card types, we got you covered here. There's no Pithing Needle in the format, so it's basically one of these really. And then there's things like Abeyance as well, which can stop activated abilities. Powder Keg, this is a main deckable card as well. It's just an answer for things that are scary. It's artifacts or creatures, so you see decks that can't necessarily blow up artifacts very easily. Like black decks, you can see leveraging Powder Keg quite often, but it's able to blow up Phyrexian Dreadnought, which is another key reason why you're seeing it in people's main decks right now. Sideways Web. So we mentioned all the manlands and stuff that are out there. They all come in tapped, apart from the Factory, but obviously once it taps once, then it's not going to be untapping. So Sideboard's Web is a pretty annoying card for a lot of decks to play against, especially since we've already discussed the quality of mana bases in the format. If you're having one tap down forever, that's not ideal. Also, this is a main deckable card in decks like that Flinker deck, where it's able to use this because it cantrips. It can use this to suppress your opponent's resources a little bit, and then it can tinker it into something it needs to win the game with. So this is a bunch of stuff you need to be aware of. Obviously, there's a lot of cards in the format, and there's lots of space for brewing as well. But these are some things you need to know about. Next up, I think we're just going to take a quick look at what the meta looks like. For free, fast, and secure worldwide shipping on high-end singles, classic products, and full sets, check out 3for1 Trading. Whether it's the legacy or pre-modern that I play on this channel, or even vintage and old school, they've got you covered. Find them through the link in the description of this video and use my code COWFREE for free worldwide shipping on your first order over $500 or euros. So at the very top of the pile we have Stiflenaut. This is a mono blue build. Just a quick look at what it's trying to do. It's got 4 Phyrexian Dreadnought and 2 Mistress Factories as win conditions. It's got a bunch of like card draws, so things like, well, card manipulation I should say. So it's like Opts and Portents and stuff like that. It's got the whole like Gush package. And it's trying to use Flash of Insight to dig and find its combo pieces. And then in terms of interacting, it's like things like Chain of Vapor, Boomerang, and then it's got counter spells. So Foil, Daze, actual counter spell, that sort of jam. This is kind of the #1 deck that people are gunning for at the moment. Got Burn, we've already mentioned this. Ball Lightnings, Grim Lavamancer, Jackal-Pup, Mog Fanatic, Burn spells. Pretty straightforward. Goblins, just a whole bunch of good goblins, really. With Rishadan Ports and Wastelands to curtail your opponent's development whilst you're bashing them with all your guys. Parallax Replenish, we've already mentioned this, but I think we should take a closer look at it because it's kind of an interesting deck. So you've got things like Frantic Search and Intuition to go and find your pieces, and then you've got Attunement. This is one we mentioned before. Something I should also mention about Stiflenaut, it quite often boards into being a mono blue Tide deck, where it just has the ability to just keep playing Tide and resetting it with Chain of Vapors, instead of trying to just go all in on the Dreadnoughts type stuff. Oath decks. So you've got Oath Ponza with old Terravor, Oath of Druids. Sylvan Library, that's an important one that I should have mentioned earlier as well. This is just a really key part of a lot of green decks, just gives them the ability to draw extra cards. But as you can see, we've got like Stone Rain, Thermocast, Winter's Grasp, just a bunch of ways of interacting with your opponent's lands, and then Sphere of Resistance to make it so they can't cast anything. Tide Control is a deck that wins with basically Mistress Factory and Fairy Conclave, and then just controls your opponent's resources. So you've got counter spells, bounce spells. You've got things like Parallax Tide, where you can stifle the leaves the battlefield trigger, or you can Chain of Vapor it after you've done the little trick. So kind of similar-ish to the Dreadnought. Sometimes you see this deck exist within a Dreadnought shell, as in the sideboard allows it to turn into this, or vice versa. Got things like Elves here. So just a bunch of like elves, and you're just chewing them up with Survival of the Fittest using Tanglewire to suppress your opponent. You've got the Wirewood Symbiote and Queer on Rangers, so you can bounce and reset elves. And instead of using something like Elvish Visionary, you have Mortani's Acolyte as your draw engine. Blue-Green Madness is a quite popular deck. This is also the first good deck that I ever played in Magic the Gathering. So this is, you know, Aquamoeba and Wild Mongrel, just discarding, you know, your Arrogant Worms, so you get a 3-mana 4/4 Trampler. And as we've discussed, the size of creatures, a 3-mana 4/4 Trampler is pretty good. You also have things like Waterfront Bouncer, which can control the board. This particular build is a survival build. They're not always survival builds. Sometimes they're just not playing that at all. Different amounts of counter magic, including Circular Logic, which can do a lot of work here. You also see things like Roar of the Worm, which is like 4-mana flashback for a 6/6, so you can just discard that and get that going. The last of the decks listed as Tier 1 is Tide Control. So this is a blue-white control deck. So it's using things like Standstill, and then underneath the Standstill, it still gets to operate because it's got things like Mistress Factory, so it can attack you, and Dust Bowl, so it can hit your lands. So it's still operating underneath a Standstill, so it forces you to break it and give them more cards. It can also cycle a Decree of Justice, which just gives them a bunch of 1/1s without breaking the Standstill. And it's just got all the, you know, good spells. You've got Counterspell, you've got Fact or Fiction to draw cards, you've got Mana Leak, we got Source of Plowshares, you've got Wrath of God. Even Humility is in here, which is very good when you're trying to do things with Decree of Justice. And like I said, it's got the Tide combo in as well. You see Tide kind of everywhere at the moment. A lot of blue decks are just starting to include Tide since I've started playing this format. So those are all Tier 1 decks, but we're not going to click on and go into all the other ones. But what have we got here? You know, You've got things like Survival Rock, and like that's a Jundy looking survival deck, Black-White Control, Pit Rack, Terrageddon, Enchantress. If you look as well at the cost of some of these decks, $76 for Black-White Control, and this deck is one of the top tier 2 decks in the format. That's pretty sweet, to be honest. You know, Enchantress, Rock, Stasis, Grower-Tog, Devourer combo, that's like the Flinker one I was talking about. Like, you can play White Weenie decks, you've got Psychotog, different Ponza decks, Mono Black, Zoo, Contamination, Storm decks. Mono Black Clerics is really popular at the moment as well. Look how deep the tier 2 list goes. Whole bunch of decks, combo decks, aggro decks, control decks, Tron decks. Just a whole bunch of stuff in tier 2 until you get to tier 3 stuff where you're looking at stuff like Rack and then cycling decks like Fluctuator. But some of these decks are still pretty viable as well. You see them making top 8s and all sorts. So yeah, I hope that little introduction into this format lets you sort of get a better idea, a better handle of what the format is about. It's a little bit slower. The games progress in a much more civilized fashion than Legacy as I'm currently recording this. Lots of interaction. It's a very interactive format. There's not that many single cards that just run away with the game, like you see in Fire Design in recent years. There are definitely things where you assemble 2 things and it runs away with the game. But there's a lot of play to it. I've been having a lot of fun brewing. There's a lot of brewing possibilities and a lot of people who are playing the format. If you look at decks online, there's a lot of room for improvement of existing decks and archetypes. Quite often, I'm aghast at the amount of lands people are running. I think people aren't running enough lands because back in the day, you know, when people were playing like Urza's Saga and Mask's Block and all that sort of stuff, people didn't really run enough lands in their decks, even at the competitive level, in my opinion. And people were sort of revitalizing those lists from back in the day, and they're kind of keeping some of the same flaws. Like 23 land decks with 5 drops is not really where I would suggest anyone wants to be, especially in a format that is defined by wastelands, Richdown ports, and land destruction. So that's something to keep in mind. But there's a lot to like, and this website, the Premodern Magic, is a great resource. They do have like a list of decks that you can have a look at as well, just for some rough examples. And this other website is mtgdecks.net, and they have loads and loads of decks that you can go and look at. So if you're looking at getting into this format, there's plenty of cheap decks. I'm just building up Dead Guy Ale myself, which is what it says $117 here. So you can get into this format very cheaply with actually good decks that have really good play to them. So I hope that interests you. There are videos in the Premodern format on my channel at least once a month on a Saturday. If Legacy doesn't get the right bans and ends up being a pretty awkward format, I might even put some Premodern videos in my weekday videos, just maybe have one a week, just to sort of break it up a little bit if I'm tired of getting bodied by Oops or Spells or Reanimator. And if you want to see more Premodern, let me know. And let me know if there's particular things in Premodern that you're interested in. And let me know how you feel about a video like this. I don't really do videos like this where I'm not actually doing gameplay normally. I'm very rare that I'll do anything that's discussing something like this much. Certainly not as like a video on one of my weekday ones, maybe as like a bonus weekend one. So let me know what you think of this. Obviously the likes and subscribes will help too. And thank you so much for watching. Goodbye. If you'd like to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon. It has a free guide to budget turbo depths as well as 3 tiers of support. A low cost one that enters you into my monthly raffle for a free donation deck on the channel. A mid-tier subscription that gives you access to my detailed turbo depths guide that is updated every month as well as regular articles. And lastly, the higher tier gives you all of the above as well as a monthly donation deck for my channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel this way, please check out the link in the description.